Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It's time for us to once again talk about ray tracing, everyone's favorite technology to talk about, this time in Metro Exodus, which is the latest game to integrate support for NVIDIA's RTX technology. Last time we checked out ray tracing in Battlefield 5 and we were a bit disappointed with the implementation. The use of ray tracing reflections didn't add a whole lot visually, there were issues with noise, and the performance hit was pretty severe. Considering the game is reasonably fast-paced, it's a competitive shooter and all that sort of thing, ray tracing in that game, it just really isn't worth it. But things are pretty different when it comes to Metro Exodus. This isn't a competitive online shooter. Instead, it's a slower-paced, open-world, single-player survival shooter. Ray tracing is implemented as global illumination, not reflections, and the game is launching with optimized ray tracing and DLSS from day one. In this video, we'll be looking at both the quality differences between RTX on and off for this title, as well as the performance hit across all four NVIDIA GeForce RTX graphics cards at a range of resolutions. I'll spend a brief bit of time talking about how DLSS can be added to the mix, so you'll get our usual comprehensive coverage of RTX in this game today. So what is global illumination? To answer that, I'll start by talking about how lighting works without global illumination, as is the case in, well, pretty much a lot of games. Without GI, you're left with just direct illumination. So if there's a light source, anything that falls in the path of that source's lighting will be illuminated and will cast shadows. But this sort of lighting is limited and it lacks realism and depth. The reason why it lacks realism is because this sort of lighting does not include indirect illumination. In real life, light doesn't just emit from surfaces, hit something, and then just disappear. Instead, light reflects off surfaces onto other surfaces. This is what global illumination provides. With this lighting system enabled, light bounces off surfaces, creating greater depth. And if light interacts with colored surfaces along the way, this can lead to colored reflections. Caustic effects are also possible, so overall the lighting system becomes better and more realistic. Global illumination is also not new to ray tracing. It's something that has been possible previously with other techniques. However, ray tracing allows the effect to be more accurate, more realistic, and more comprehensive across a given scene. In Metro Exodus, ray traced global illumination is available in two modes. There's a high mode and an ultra mode. There's no low mode here. It's straight to high for the base implementation, and then ultra, I believe it adds further reflection steps to the computed global illumination path. I'm not sure on that one. You do also need DirectX 12 to be enabled to gain access to ray tracing, but this isn't a big deal because in our initial testing there's been no performance difference between DX11 and DX12. And you can also enable and disable ray tracing at any time without restarting the game, so that's nice to see. In terms of the visual difference, ray-traced global illumination can be subtle, it can be obvious, it all depends on the scene and what you're looking for. However, in general, the improvements ray tracing makes to Metro Exodus are far greater than the improvements DXR Reflections brought to Battlefield 5. In this scene, you can immediately see the differences between RTX on and RTX off. The scene has more depth and realism to the lighting system. It may not be obvious at first, but with global illumination disabled, some areas of the scene are illuminated where really they shouldn't be. For example, with RTX off, the boxes under the desk are illuminated by pretty much a non-existent light source here. With RTX on, these areas are correctly presented in shadow. It's a similar situation with the back of the lamp on the desk and the ceiling light. Realistically, very little light should be hitting these areas, and with global illumination enabled, that's what you're getting. It's a similar situation in this scene. With RTX off, it looks a bit weird having the bright wall and the dark pipes with the lighting present here. You might not have ever noticed an issue until you turned on RTX, where the lighting is better interacting with these two elements. Yes, it is darker, but it's more realistic, and that adds to the atmosphere. The effect is more subtle in this scene, but again, areas that shouldn't be illuminated aren't illuminated. How visible the changes are, I guess it depends on the lighting, the objects in it, the angle you're viewing, and so on. This is one of the scenes where you won't see as drastic of a change. But when you step into the above ground areas of the game, particularly during the day, RTX has some of the biggest changes I've spotted. Here it has almost the opposite effect of the darker underground sections. Rather than removing light from surfaces that shouldn't have it, global illumination outdoors tends to add light to where it should be. This scene, for example, has lots of points of reflection, including the snow and several walls behind the camera. camera, so again it makes sense that it's brighter, with less shadowed areas and better surface interactions. Another interesting note to make about this scene is the tone. The RTX off environment has a slight yellow tone due to the colour of the sun, but with RTX off, it's whiter thanks to the light reflecting off white and grey walls and snow. This is one of the other advantages to global illumination. This is another scene where there is a significant difference between RTX on and off. RTX off feels like it has a general ambient light from a non-existent source, whereas the RTX on footage sees its light come solely from the windows and overhead lights, which creates a darker, though more natural looking presentation. Look at the soldiers on the right in particular. With RTX on, they are more illuminated than the two central characters, as they're standing directly under a light, whereas the central characters are not. So when you turn RTX off, the scene is lit more evenly. The central characters are roughly as bright as the soldiers on the right, which really doesn't make sense given the position of the light sources. Most of the other scenes I captured just continue to show off the aspects I've already mentioned. Throughout most of the game, these are fairly significant and visually obvious changes to the lighting system. From what I've seen, the lighting appears more realistic and more in line with what you'd expect when considering where light sources are placed and so on. To me, there is greater depth and a more natural look. But it's also not a definitive case of RTX on being better. With reflections, aside from the noise issues, it was clear that ray trace reflections were superior to screen space reflections from a visual standpoint. With ray traced global illumination, while I feel the lighting is more realistic and has more depth, it is a bit more of an artistic change. Some people may like the RTX off presentation more if they prefer brighter scenes in darker areas and more shadowing and bright outdoor lighting. There are a few more points I want to make on the visuals before diving into performance. I found it very difficult to spot any changes between the high and ultra modes. Sometimes I thought there was a small difference, only to discover the differences were more down to the game's dynamic, slightly changing lighting system, rather than the jump from high to ultra RTX. So without looking at performance, it's pretty safe to say that high is the way to go here. There is no noise present anywhere with ray traced global illumination, at least that I could see. This was a big issue with reflections, but it's not visible in Metro Exodus. It's quite clearly a fantastic thing, because in some scenes the noise in Battlefield 5's ray traced reflection was extremely noticeable and could look worse than with ray tracing disabled. In Metro, it's pretty much a non-issue. It's also important to note that the game doesn't feel like something is missing from the lighting system when RTX is disabled. It's not a situation where the developers have removed an effect from the non-RTX version of the game only to bring it back through ray tracing. The game still looks phenomenal with RTX off. It just, at least in my opinion, looks even better and more accurate with RTX on. Then there's the question, could 4A Games, the developer of Metro Exodus, have achieved the same global illumination effect without ray tracing? It's quite tricky to answer because there's no switch to simply enable a non-ray traced global illumination in this game to make a nice comparison. I haven't looked extensively into its implementation in other games, but my feel is that Metro Exodus's RTX-based global illumination is more accurate and more comprehensive. It definitely looks pretty good here. It's probably the most accurate lighting system I've seen. Also, global illumination through other techniques already tends to be a fairly computationally intensive effect. Turning ray tracing on does come with a sizable performance hit, as we'll see in a moment. However, this has tended to be the case with other games that use global illumination as well. The RTX penalty, it is most likely going to be larger. However, it's also a better implementation, so I'm not as concerned with this being a pointless re-engineering of global illumination as I was with reflections. If you remember, we saw reflections done really well without ray tracing at a much lower performance cost in Hitman 2. Examples of global illumination done as well as Metro Exodus with a much lower performance cost, well, that's a lot rarer, if not possible. And there's a chance that using ray tracing is easier for developers than other techniques, which could mean better visuals from fewer development resources. So moving into performance, probably should go over the test setup before I get into the numbers. I've tested all the RTX GPUs using my Intel Core i9-9900K test rig, although the CPU, it really doesn't matter here because the game is very GPU demanding. Latest drivers were used, so that's NVIDIA's 418.91, the day one drivers for Metro Exodus. I also tested with both the pre-release and day one versions of the game, and I found no difference in performance there. The performance data is from Metro Exodus's built-in benchmark tool. This really helped to simplify the testing process and make it highly repeatable, but I want to put a big warning sign somewhere here on the screen because there's a very important few things to note about Metro's benchmark tool. I've played a few hours of the game as well, and so far the benchmark tool represents performance in the most intensive areas of the game. In fact, if anything, the benchmark is more intensive than the game itself. Throughout most of the game, you can expect performance better than the benchmark tool shows. However, in those really intense areas, the benchmark is, I guess, a reasonable reflection of in-game performance. If anything, I feel the benchmark does a better job of showing performance with RTX on, while underrepresenting RTX off performance somewhat. I'll elaborate this a little bit after the charts, but the margins between RTX on and off in the benchmark are usually slightly smaller than the margins you'll see in the game itself. However, the tool also tests areas in the game I haven't personally gotten up to yet, so I'm not sure whether there are more intensive scenes to come. I simply haven't had time to, play the game to actually get to any more sections. All other settings were set to Ultra in the benchmark. The only setting I changed was ray tracing. There is an extreme preset above Ultra, but I felt Ultra was the better balance. Several settings are not encompassed in the main preset, I guess you'd have to say, and these are all enabled with motion blur set to normal, tessellation on full, and both PhysX and Hairworks enabled. Yes, both those features are included here. DLSS was disabled. So we'll start with the 1080p data here. Immediately from the RTX off data, you can see the game is very intensive in its worst case scenarios. Steve will go into more detail on this in his full Metro Exodus GPU benchmark in the coming days, but at least you get a little bit of a sneak preview of some of the results here. An RTX 2070 is required for a 60 FPS average in the benchmark at just 1080p, while the most intensive parts of the tool see that performance dip to near 30 FPS. So yeah, it's a bit painful, but again, throughout most of the game I've played, you'll see performance higher than this. A good example is the RTX 2080 Ti, which averages 90 FPS here, but for many sections of the game, this is up more around 120 FPS, aside from some of the most intense scenes. The good news is enabling ray-traced global illumination doesn't tank performance to anywhere near the degree of ray-traced reflections in Battlefield 5. Looking at the RTX high results, we only saw a 17% increase in performance from disabling RTX at 1080p for the RTX 2080 Ti. This grows slightly to 21% for both the RTX 2080 and RTX 2070, and 24% for the RTX 2060. And the margins are smaller again when looking at 1% lows, so it's clear that in the very most intensive areas of Metro Exodus, it's not ray tracing that is causing that extra performance drop. The Ultra setting is more intensive again. There's around a 10% gap between the two modes, so for the RTX 2080 Ti, turning ray tracing down from Ultra to off sees a 26% performance improvement rather than 17% from high to off. Considering there's almost no visual change between high and Ultra, I really don't see why you would use the Ultra mode here. With Battlefield 5, the performance you gain from turning DXR reflections from just the low mode to off hovered between 50 and 60% for most GPUs at 1080p. With Metro Exodus, going from high to off is more like 20%, so it's clear the performance impact here is nowhere near the level of Battlefield 5. However, with the RTX 2060 hovering around 41 FPS on average with Ultra settings at 1080p and using the high RTX mode, I feel that ray tracing still isn't well suited to NVIDIA's lowest level card capable of ray trace. Again, it is a worst case scenario, but that level of performance is quite low, especially with the 1% lows below 30 FPS. At 1440p, the margins do grow a bit compared to 1080p. Here the RTX 2080 Ti sees a 25% uplift switching from high to off. That margin is up around 28% for the 2070 and 2080, while the 2060 sees a 36% performance gain. The RTX 2060 does not perform well at 1440p with ray tracing here, so it's not something I'd recommend. Even the RTX 2070 is a bit borderline in the benchmark. Meanwhile, the RTX 2080 and RTX 2080 Ti are at acceptable levels of performance. Moving to 4K, and this is a resolution that simply wasn't worth using with ray tracing in Battlefield 5. With Metro Exodus, it's borderline. The RTX 2080 Ti sees a 38% uplift in performance at this resolution with RTX disabled, so much higher than 1440p and 1080p. This shows once again that ray tracing doesn't scale nicely with resolution. The performance impact is higher with each resolution jump, especially when going all the way to 4K. The 2080 and 2070 get hit harder again, but both cards aren't great for 4K gaming in this title to begin with, especially the 2070. Meanwhile, the RTX 2080 Ti is really the only GPU I'd consider using for high ray tracing in this game at 4K, and even then, I'd feel the performance impact is probably too large for most gamers. Going from a 47 FPS average, which isn't amazing but playable for this sort of game, to a mid-30s frame rate is not great. With that said, you will get better frame rates with RTX on at 1440p than you will with RTX off at 4K. So again, unlike with Battlefield 5, there's not the same level of trade-off between resolution and ray tracing. As I mentioned earlier, the benchmark is a bit of a worst case scenario for performance in general, but it's also typically a best case scenario for the margin between RTX on and RTX off. It's a bit weird in that regard. I've played the opening few sequences of the game twice with both RTX on and RTX off, and the margins between the two playthroughs at 4K was sort of 35% on the low end, but as high as 60% or more in some areas. It can vary a bit between scenes and levels, so it's hard to nail down an exact figure that's representative of the game. However, the benchmark delivered a 38% margin, which typically was on the better end of the performance impact scale. With that said, typical in-game margins looked more reasonable at 1440p and 1080p, where the benchmark showed a 17 to 25% gain from disabling ray tracing, whereas in the game itself up to a 30% gap is what you can expect. In the worst cases for ray tracing, aside from playing at 4K, you won't see 50% margins, which was a key issue with Battlefield 5's ray traced reflections. Will DLSS improve upon these performance numbers? Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that enabling DLSS with RTX on takes performance back up to around the level of RTX off. In fact, RTX on with the high mode plus DLSS was around 8% faster at 4K than RTX off, although performance was 12% lower than just running the game at 1440p with RTX on. DLSS at 1440p with RTX on was actually a little slower than RTX off though. But it's also not an improvement because the visual quality is not equivalent. The 4K DLSS presentation is noticeably softer and blurrier than native 4K. I have more thoughts on DLSS in a separate video looking at Battlefield 5's implementation as well, but to me, if I'm playing at 4K, I want the native sharp image, which is especially nice in Metro Exodus, and you simply won't get that with DLSS enabled. Alright, so that's another ray tracing investigation complete. You might have noticed there's a bit of a different tone to this video compared to the last one on Battlefield 5. This really hasn't been another video where I guess we take a dump on RTX from a great height. It's actually genuinely quite different in Metro Exodus, so I wanted to come at this one with a fresh perspective. The big question here is, should you turn on RTX? And the answer is, well, it depends. It's not a universal recommendation, but that is an improvement from where things were at with RTX in Battlefield 5. With DXR reflections, I really could not recommend anyone use the feature, and it really didn't do a good job of selling the benefits of ray tracing. But with Metro Exodus, there are some cases where it actually makes sense to turn RTX on. One of the key differences is the game itself. Metro is a slower single-player game. Yeah, you'll still want good performance, but part of the game's experience is in the breathtaking visuals. There's not as much to gain from playing Metro Exodus at above 100 FPS compared to a competitive multiplayer shooter like Battlefield. Then there are two additional factors that make this implementation better than Battlefield 5. Firstly, the visual change is larger. It may not be subjectively better for every person. Your opinion on how it looks may vary, even depending on the scene. But I found the differences were more noticeable throughout the game on the whole. With reflections, it was only some areas where you could spot the effects of ray tracing, and in some instances it was horribly noisy. But with ray trace global illumination, almost every environment in the game is lit differently, and in my opinion, more accurately. To me, RTX on looked better most of the time, sometimes substantially so. And then there's the performance hit. It's not as bad as DXR reflections either. The hit is still there, especially at 4K, but it doesn't feel like we're in crazy territory anymore. A 20 to 30% improvement from disabling the effect is still one of the larger hits for any individual graphics effect, but it's not 50 to 60% like it was with reflections. It's also in line with some of the larger performance hits we've seen from non-RTX effects in games over the last few years, so again, nothing crazy. When you combine all of these factors, RTX Global Illumination in Metro Exodus is looking a lot more favorable. It's a game that benefits from stunning visuals, RTX on looks better most of the time, and the performance hit is manageable. This is really how RTX should have launched to the public. If this is what gamers got the first time they saw ray tracing in person, I think people's impressions would have been a lot more positive. But again, it does depend on your situation as to whether RTX is a feature worth enabling in the game. At 4K, the higher than usual performance hit makes RTX not worth it, even with an RTX 2080 Ti. You're only going to get a 60 FPS experience with RTX off at 4K with Nvidia's flagship GPU. Cutting into that performance significantly is really not a choice I'd make. I'd also tend to err on the side of not using RTX for any configuration where you're not already hitting 60 FPS or thereabouts, especially if you don't have an adaptive sync monitor. So this would include the RTX 2060 at 1080p or the RTX 2070 at 1440p. I feel the experience with RTX off at 60 FPS is better than RTX on at maybe 45 to 50 FPS or so in both instances. But if there's headroom to spare and you're a gamer that loves improved visuals, then yeah, there is something to be gained from playing with RTX enabled. One example would be the RTX 2080 at 1440p. From what I've experienced, that card runs Metro comfortably above 60 FPS at that resolution, aside from the most intensive situations. You turn on ray tracing and the game is still a 60 FPS experience with improved visuals. If you love graphics, I don't see how that's a bad thing when you're still achieving strong performance in this title. I do hope though that one day we're in a situation where using RTX can be a recommendation in all situations, but from a first generation product with the second game to include the feature, it really is a lot more promising than I originally thought. It still shouldn't be used as a factor in buying a new graphics card because there are still so few games even announced to support the tech, but those that get a good deal on an RTX GPU can enjoy this as a little bonus. And that's it for my thoughts on Metro Exodus ray tracing. I think the game comes out today for the general public. It looks seriously good. So this is one of those titles I think that PC gamers will be loving, aside from the whole Epic Game Store thing, which, yeah, it's a bit disappointing that happened around the launch of this game, but yeah, the game itself seems to be really good. We'll have a few follow-up pieces in the next few days that are definitely worth subscribing for. We'll have a full GPU benchmark from Steve. There's also an optimization guide in the works and a further look into DLSS, along with DLSS in Battlefield 5, which also launched recently, so stay tuned as we work on those. Consider supporting us on Patreon. It takes a long time and many extra hours to produce these sorts of videos in a timely manner, so we really appreciate all the support we get from our Patrons that makes all of this possible, and I'll catch you in the next one.